Have you ever wondered why there are so many burnt down houses in Alabama? I recently did a story out of Mill Village outside of Sylacauga, and we have received a lot of pushback from many people in Alabama telling us that the reasons I said these houses were burning down was a complete lie. So in today's video, we're going to dig deeper into why are there so many burnt down houses in Alabama. After all, Alabama's residential fire rate is more than 2 times the national average and 4 times for African Americans, since the main victim of house fires in Alabama seems to be African Americans. Despite that, the people in Alabama say that it's the meth heads and the homeless people who are burning down houses. I recently did a video in Sylacauga, Alabama about the many burnt down houses in the Mill Village. And everybody in this town by this point has seen the video and vented their frustration about how everything I said was a lie. But shoutouts to everybody in the Mill Village and Sylacauga for putting me onto this story. Now, in my article, I published that these fires were set intentionally, and the people in Sylacauga, Alabama are furious, stating that these fires are all either meth lab explosions or accidental wire fires. Now, we did some real research on this topic, and despite people's opinions, on today's video, we're going to give you some real life stories out of Alabama so we can understand the truth behind why are so many houses burning in Alabama. According to the Alabama State Fire Marshal, a considerable percentage of fires in Alabama are what we call arsons, intentional fires. So the notion that everybody is attacking me saying that this doesn't happen in Alabama and that 99% of these fires are caused by meth heads is absolutely not analytical. It may be your opinion, but it isn't analytical. And let's not forget that there's a crap load of arrests and stories on the internet of recent fires in this region of Alabama, so let's take a look at them. I guess the first story we're going to look at is this video footage out of Sylacauga, Alabama, where the Mill Village is, that shows an individual committing an arson in broad daylight. So the notion that these are all meth labs blowing up is clearly dismissed by this recent video where the police department's trying to figure out who the crap tried to burn down a bunch of buildings. So already this active video that's on the internet of the police looking for a suspect that in broad daylight burned down a bunch of buildings in Sylacauga is enough to prove my point that these fires are being set intentionally, despite the obvious fact that a lot of these buildings are being burnt on purpose. People in Sylacauga accuse me of being a liar and spreading misinformation. And it's noteworthy that many years back, the actual mill itself caught on fire, and they blamed it on a lightning strike. So it isn't just dozens of houses in this community that have burnt up. The actual mill itself went up in flames. So it's quite an alarming amount of fires in this area of Alabama. Like I said, Alabama's rate is more than 2 times the national average, and arson is one of the leading causes of fires. So why is it a surprise that a state as dangerous, violent, and hateful as Alabama has an alarming amount of fires in one community that are intentional when that's exactly what the analytics suggest? Back in 2018, a homeless man from North Carolina was charged with setting a blaze at a church in Sylacauga. A Florida man was charged with some horrendous crimes in Prattville, Alabama, including arson for setting a building on fire. It's interesting how many of the people that get arrested for these fires in Alabama are people from other states, when these types of crimes don't seem to happen in other states. I think the most horrendous crime is a woman out of Jacksonville, Alabama, who tried to burn down a Jack's restaurant. Now, I'm not really a defender of Alabama, but when it comes to Jack's, anybody who tries to burn down a Jack's needs to have a life sentence for it. That's a horrendous crime to do right there. So it wasn't a meth lab explosion in the bathroom of this Jack's. It was a disgruntled employee who wanted to burn the freaking building down in a rage-filled attack on chicken. I know this is a far stretch, but maybe it was a racist act. Maybe she thought if she burned down the chicken place, all the black people in this town would just have the worst day of their lifetime. Regardless of her intentions, trying to set the bathroom on fire, she was arrested as a disgruntled employee, and it was once again an arson, something done on purpose. She tried to burn down the freaking Jack's. Practically the only thing in Alabama worth protecting, the freaking chicken place. We hop on down to the Montgomery area where a Millbrook man decided to burn down his mother's house because she refused to let him come inside to take a shower. Now, most people in Alabama, you gotta beat them to make them take a shower. Here's a person that wants to take a shower and they arrest him for it. That's just wrong. Regardless, this young man is facing a very serious charge of trying to set his mother's house on fire because she wouldn't let him go inside to take a shower. Any mother should let her children take a shower in her house, but apparently this woman decided, not my boy can't be out there showering and stuff like that. Also in Millbrook, Alabama is another explosive story. That's High Country Road where I used to live. You can see that's just down the road from High Country is where our next story comes from. This person, a bunch of teenagers apparently, tried to set an explosive in front of somebody's house. Luckily, the person wasn't injured, but if she had remained outside of the door, she would have been definitely hurt by this crazy attack. Somewhat of an arson, maybe even more aggravated than that. Take a look at those apartments with the red roofs. This area where I used to live was absolutely wild. It's full of stories like this. Just a few blocks down the road in the same neighborhood where I used to live, this man right here popped his sister in an argument. It seems like she survived the altercation, and this was only as recently as back in December. These aren't old stories. Anybody subscribed to my channel for a while may remember that I received threats that they were going to burn my house on High Country Road, and the only reason they didn't burn it down is because I told them it was insured for twice what it was worth, and if they burned down the house, they would only be helping me. A lot of people said that that was a lie and that this would never happen in Millbrook, so let's continue to look at some more recent stories of arson from where? Good old Millbrook, Alabama, right where I used to live. These people in the comments section saying that these are all meth lab explosions might not be aware that I myself lived in Alabama among you savages, and I know exactly how you people get down, like if I wasn't familiar with your antics by now. Another story in the same little area where I used to live, just out of September, a 17-year-old was arrested for shooting into Millbrook homes. Apparently these kids had gotten a hold of some stolen arms, most likely by doing home break-ins, and they used it to shoot around the neighborhood until the cops came and they all ran, but eventually they caught one of the people involved. Then there's this story out of Millbrook on Peach Circle. This individual right here lives on the same street as a cop apparently. Well, he goes ahead and decided to try to burn down his own house with 4 dogs inside, but he was apprehended by the Millbrook Police Department. 44-year-old man, it's not exactly sure what his intentions were in burning his own house with his dogs inside. Perhaps it was some type of insurance fraud, nobody knows. Whatever his intentions were in burning down his own house, living across the street from a police officer in Millbrook was kind of crazy. And by the way, that house right there, I worked for those people when I lived in Millbrook. Really nice people. It's just a shame that they would have to live next door to somebody that would try to burn their own freaking house down. So as you can see in Millbrook, Alabama, where I used to live, arson is just the order of the day. It happens all the time in Alabama, and the notion that every single burnt down house is a meth lab is an absolute sack of Alabama garbage. There's a lot of arson going on in the state. Sometimes it's insurance fraud, but the most common cause seems to be, well, family disputes. Let's take a look at some of these most recent arson cases and you'll see what I mean. Practically the most horrifying story is out of Pine Level. This is a little place right outside of Millbrook and Prattville, just to the north. Now, the 73-year-old woman had gone many times to law enforcement in Ottawa County and told them that this individual arrested here was trying to hurt her, and they kept telling her that if she didn't go back to her home, they were going to arrest her. Take a moment, pause the video, and read the story. To summarize it, she had gone repetitively to the Ottawa County Sheriff's Office pleading for help regarding this individual. They told her that if she kept coming for help, they were going to arrest her. So now that law enforcement refused to help her with her pleas for help, he goes on to try to set the house on fire. At 73 years old, she jumped out of a window with a dog to save her life. Here's the hypocrisy of the Ottawa County Sheriff's Office. After this, the woman became homeless and was living out of a motel. So a female officer from the Ottawa County Sheriff's Office visited her at her hotel to tell her that if you needed help, you could have just called us. And this just goes to show how dangerous, hypocritical law enforcement is in Alabama. Now, you guys may have heard my personal experience where I said that when I called the cops The cops told me that I was an illegal Mexican and they were going to arrest me for being here illegally if I called law enforcement asking for help again, and they couldn't help me. Many people said that that's a lie and that law enforcement in Alabama would never do that. Well, that's exactly the same thing they did to this lady right here. They told her, hey, if you keep coming to us for help, we're going to go ahead and arrest you. She finally becomes a victim, and when she becomes a victim, they go back to her with some food and gifts at a motel and tell her, hey, you could have just called us for help. We were right here. This highlights exactly the level of hypocrisy that I have been telling you guys with all of my stories about what I experienced in Alabama. And while these stories are sad, they certainly vindicate my stories in the mode of operation of how these things work in Alabama. You're the victim, and when you go to law enforcement for help, law enforcement actually makes the situation even worse for you. And then finally, when you do become a victim, law enforcement says, well, why didn't you come to us for help? Doesn't this kind of remind you of what happened with the Hispanics that were being killed in Montgomery for robberies, where law enforcement says, hey, why didn't y'all just come to help we were going to help you from the start, from the get-go? This story highlights the mode of operation of these sheriff's offices in Alabama. These agencies are completely complicit in the victimization of people because their lack of effort and their hypocrisy. Not only do they not do anything, but they're kind of, well, instead of going after the perpetrators, many times they go after the freaking victim. I urge you to stop the video and read that story in detail, and it'll resonate exactly with the same mode of operation of what I experienced in Alabama. Many times, these law enforcement agencies and other people in the community know exactly what's going on. They know that people are being hurt by people that are threatening them, and instead of helping them, they actually make it even harder for the victim. Just a little north of where I used to live in Holtville, this was back in 2015, this individual here decided to burn down his ex-girlfriend's house at 3 in the morning. So where do these people in Alabama get the notion that arsons are not taking place? A huge percentage of these arsons in Alabama are the reason why so many houses are burnt down in this state. Yet the locals want to continue to perpetrate the notion of blaming the victims versus trying to seek actual judgment, justice. And this is part of the problem in Alabama. As you can see, law enforcement and people in the community, instead of seeking justice for the victims of these arsons, are actually playing the card of taking sides with the perpetrators and saying, if your house burnt down, it's because you had a meth lab. Let's rub that off and never actually seek justice for victims. Then you got this special person right here. He lives in rural Titus, a backwards community in Elmore County. This individual had been going around setting fires continually. They actually had to set up hours of surveillance to try to figure out who was setting the fires. And eventually they figured out that this individual, for some reason or another, just likes setting fires. Now keep in mind that arson in the state of Alabama is a serious crime. It carries a penalty of up to 20 years in prison. So for the people in Sylacauga saying that all these burnt down houses are nothing more than meth labs, Sylacauga man just in April was arrested for setting fire to a bedroom. I mean, what's crazy is that just in the last few months, there's been a bunch of arson cases in Sylacauga, yet the people here act like what I said was a complete lie, calling me a liar, telling me these were meth lab explosions, telling me that I'm making their community look bad, and all these horrendous things about my YouTube channel, when in reality, I'm actually getting a real story out of your community, exposing that all these arsons are taking place. Yet, the people in the community, instead of trying to look out for justice for the victims, are more concerned in protecting the perpetrators. Because when you try to cover up and be a victim blamer like the Sylacauga County Sheriff's Office, instead of helping victims when they're pleading for help, you're telling them that they're liars and it's all meth labs and you just need to go back and take care of yourself and behave. You're out of control. You're a liar. That's what they told her. Go back and read the story from the lady in Sylacauga County. They told her, you're just a liar. You need to behave and stop bothering law enforcement. You're escalating things unnecessarily. Well, here she is, nearly died in a freaking fire, jumping out a window with her freaking dog at 73 years old. Finally, this man was arrested. The woman ended up homeless. She tried to warn the Sylacauga County Sheriff's Office of the threat. Instead of helping her, they literally tried to go after her. And then they had the hypocrisy to come around and say, well, you could have just asked us for help. You know, we were always here for you. That's the hypocrisy of people in Alabama. Always being a victim blamer and always ensuring that victims can't get justice by siding with the perpetrators versus protecting the rights of the victims. I'm starting to realize and resonate with me that many of the things that I personally experience in Alabama are exactly what many other people in Alabama are experiencing. And I always thought it was racially motivated because they told me it was racially motivated. But on top of that, I'm starting to realize that this is just the way these people get down. This is just the way people in Alabama function. And I'm sure to the people in Alabama who've been victimized, who've been threatened by law enforcement, who instead of being helped have been hurt when they claimed they needed help, those people have to resonate strongly with my videos because they understand that what I'm doing and bringing awareness to this situation is for people like them. And I didn't wake up one day and decide to be a hero for the people. I experienced victimization myself in the state of Alabama, but now I'm finding out that many of the things that happened to me have systematically been happening to so many people in Alabama, and they've had to leave their homes behind. Everything they worked for has been lost because the criminals went after them, took everything they had from them, left them with nothing, and then law enforcement comes around and pretends like they were your friend the whole time, when they knew what the problem was and they did nothing about it. Not only have I experienced this in my own personal skin, in my own life, but it's been the story for a lot of people in Alabama who've lost their homes and lost everything they have. They were victimized by somebody. They went to law enforcement for help, and law enforcement, instead of siding with the victims, sided with the criminals. And all these people in the comment section calling me a liar, they're not stupid. They know what's going on. Look at this one. He says, I'm a first responder. I know these are all meth lab explosions. Well, Jose, that's pretty credible, right? This guy says he's a first responder, and he knows they're meth lab explosions. How do you counter that, Jose? Well, here's a former volunteer firefighter who was charged with arson. The irony, right? The person that's supposed to volunteer to stop the fires is actually out there starting the fires himself. And this should just be an opening window into the world of Alabama. You may have heard me say in the past that if you disappear in Alabama, the people who made you disappear would be the ones taking charge and looking for you. Well, this is a perfect example of a scenario like that. Here's a person who's in charge of stopping fires, and he's out there setting the fires himself. Just like I said, if you disappear in Alabama, perhaps the people that are going to be looking for you are the same ones who made you disappear. This is the reality of Alabama. So no, these people, they're not blind, they're not misled. They know what's going on in their communities, but they want to cover it up. They want to continue to blame the victims. Instead of seeking justice for them, they take sides with the perpetrators, and it leaves victims in a completely helpless situation, voiceless and helpless. By putting out today's story and the story about the houses that are being set on fire in the Mill Village, who knows what the real intention and motive are of these fires? It's none of my business. I don't live there. But the reality is that all these fires that are happening in Alabama, all these arsons, some of them even caught on video recently. They're looking for these people that are doing this. It isn't exactly what we're being told. They want you to believe that every single trailer that catches fire in Alabama is a meth lab explosion. But in reality, people are being forced out of their homes. People's properties are being stolen from them. And sadly, with law enforcement and firefighters show up, many times instead of being on the side of helping find resolution and justice for the victims, they're actually on the team of the people that burn your freaking place down. Imagine living in a place where your house burns down and the law enforcement who knew the threat, did nothing about it, come back and tell you, hey, you could have just told us we were here the whole time for you. Very hypocritical. What about the firefighter who sets your own house on fire and then comes to put out the flame? This is the reality of living in these places in Alabama. The firefighters and law enforcement, they're going to respond to helping you put out the blaze, are the same people who started it. What type of justice do you think you're going to get in a place like that? And then you got this Riley Freeman looking dude in Boaz who's being charged with setting a blaze to a building. Another thing that happens very often in Alabama, I'm not saying it's particularly what happened in this case, but what happens many times as well, is that law enforcement will know that homeless people are in a vacant building. Then law enforcement itself will have the house burned down, and then they'll charge the homeless people with burning the house down, even though it was law enforcement who started the fire. It's just a way of law enforcement to be able to get rid of homeless people. Law enforcement comes and they set a fire where the homeless people are, and then they arrest the homeless people for setting the fire. This has been happening quite a bit in Alabama. where people are telling me that in their communities, they have seen it happen time and time again, where homeless people are squatting a property, law enforcement comes, sets the house on fire, and then they try to arrest the people for having the house set on fire. And here's another sad and very possible scenario for some of these people. Law enforcement, complicit with criminals, burns your house down. Then you get arrested for starting the fire yourself. This is likely something that has happened to people in Alabama. Could you imagine that? Somebody comes and burns your house down, and then you get arrested for you being the one that did it. These movies like the Django, the movie called Life, perhaps you've heard of Mississippi Burning, these stories are not far from the reality that is still to this day being lived by the people of Alabama. And while many times it is racially motivated, many times it's just making the wrong enemies. You're talking about a state where the people that burn your house down are the ones that are going to come and put the fire out. The ones that you go to for help to prevent being victimized are the ones that are friends with the people that are targeting you. This is the level of injustice that you have in the state of Alabama. And when you read these comments of people saying these are all meth lab explosions, these people are sympathizers with the perpetrators that are preventing the victims from having their justice because their stories are never heard. And they still got the nerve to say that my story of what I experienced in Alabama is a lie, when there's a handful of stories along the same line experienced by people all throughout Alabama. 15-year-old right in my neighborhood, again where I used to live, shooting weapons. This was in March of 2024, so you can see that just in the last year, right in that neighborhood in Millbrook where I used to live, there have been several arsons, there have been people getting shot left and right, kids armed with weapons. Practically everything that I've been telling you guys about what it was like to live in Millbrook, Alabama, you're starting to see these news reports come out confirming to you the nature of these types of people. You're seeing firefighters being arrested for starting fires. Finally, victims that have been crying for help to law enforcement, when they finally actually have these things realized, law enforcement comes around with a hypocritical story of, oh, you could have always came to us and approached us for help. This is how they get down in Alabama, and this is why these stories need to be told. Arson continues to be a serious threat for anybody living in Alabama. If these criminals want you out of your house, out of your property, they have the power to do it. And many times complicit with firefighters, law enforcement, and everybody else down the line, when they start to victimize you, you have absolutely no ability to defend yourself. They strip everything that you have from underneath you. And back to the Mill Village in Sylacauga, more and more stories of houses burning down, but no real explanation. It isn't normal for so many houses to burn down in a single place. A lot of people say they're all meth labs. Really? You have 15 meth labs in a small neighborhood? How much meth do you guys consume in Alabama? It's fairly obvious that these are intentional fires. The propensity of it, the number in one single area, it isn't normal. However, despite the obvious, many of the people here continue to side with the perpetrators and not the victims by discrediting their stories, and many people whose homes have been burned down in Alabama have not had a chance to have these stories told. Do meth labs explode in Alabama? Yes. But does Alabama have more meth labs than West Virginia? Absolutely no. More meth labs than Eastern Kentucky? Absolutely no. Now, I've lived in Kentucky. I'm in Kentucky all the time. I'm in West Virginia. I'm in Kentucky. And I'm in these hollers and backwards places where these things do happen. I can tell you that there is definitely not a chance in the world that Alabama has more meth labs than Eastern Kentucky and West Virginia. So these stories that every single house that's burned down in these cities happens to be a meth lab, it isn't possible because there just isn't that much meth in Alabama. I lived in this area and I've lived in Kentucky. Not a chance in the world there's more meth in Alabama than there is in those places. So that story simply doesn't check out. The reality is, if you look at arrest reports, you'll see a number. It's just an overwhelming number of arsons taking place in the state of Alabama. Finally, one person had the guts to say it's actually the city that's going in here and burning down some of these houses. And another 2 or 3 people confirmed that statement as well. So the cities actually go in and burn down the houses if they don't want the people there. If they're being occupied by homeless people, the city does what they call a controlled burn. Now, in what world does the city have the authority to burn down your house? I have no idea, but that's the way things work in Alabama. Now, going back to High Country Road where I used to live in Millbrook, there was a mobile home 2 houses over that burned to the ground before I moved there. Now, the first story I heard, it was a meth lab explosion. But later on, I got some details about what actually happened there. Turned out that there was a black person living in the house, and the black person was running a cultivation operation. So I don't know the specifics of exactly what was going on, but apparently during the winter time in Alabama, you can heat up logs inside your house, and the house will actually get pretty warm. So what many people do in Alabama is that they have growing operations inside of a house or a mobile home, and they use the logs to keep the inside of the mobile home warm. So that way it doesn't raise their electric bill, so it doesn't bring any suspicion. So what people will do is that they'll have a lot of firewood, and they'll keep that firewood running to keep the inside of the house nice and warm, and they'll just have to run fans to ventilate it, and that leads to a lot of fire. So many of these quote-unquote meth lab explosions are not really meth lab explosions. It's somebody who, particularly during the winter time, will be able to start a grow operation inside a house or a mobile home using the logs to keep the mobile home warm. Doesn't raise your electric bill, which doesn't bring any suspicion about why you have a high electric bill, which is how most people who run an indoor grow operation get busted. The vast majority of fires in Alabama happen during the winter time, and it's during this time of the year where if somebody is having a fire pit burning all the time inside their house, or if they have a fireplace, it doesn't really draw a lot of attention. In the state of Alabama, particularly rural communities, it isn't out of the norm to see somebody who has a fireplace and they keep it running throughout the whole winter, which just happens to be the perfect cover story for somebody running an indoor growing operation. So many times these fires are actually not meth labs, they're indoor growing operations. They figure out that by keeping the house warm during the winter using logs, they can actually generate a lot of energy that's off the charts, which means they can have an indoor growing operation. And many of the fires that you see in rural Alabama are not meth lab explosions, they are indoor growing operations. But again, nobody talks about that. One day, my neighbor was drinking a couple beers and for some reason decided to tell me the story of how his indoor growing operation caught fire. And there it is. If you've ever wondered why there are so many burnt down houses in Alabama, some of them are meth labs, but too many of these cases, everyone is particular. Some are meth labs, some are indoor growing operations, others are arsons. The vast majority of these arson cases seem to be family disputes. And I guess the scariest part about what's happening in Alabama is that you can't put any trust in law enforcement or even firefighters per se. When it comes to these issues, it seems like many times the people who are coming to put out the fire may be the ones that had it set to begin with. That is a sad reality of life in Alabama, where you can buy properties, buy real estate, start a life, and see it all burn up in flames because somebody doesn't want you there. And for the individuals who said that I was lying and that nobody has ever ran somebody out of a house in Alabama, on today's video, I shared with you guys dozens of stories about recent arson cases in the state of Alabama that confirm exactly what I was telling you. And I'm talking cases in Sylacauga and Millbrook where I used to live. Recent stories. Even recent enough to where law enforcement still has a video of one of the recent events. They're looking for these people as we speak, in theory, unless they're involved with themselves. And it raises an interesting question. If law enforcement and even firefighters are many times complicit in what's going on, how much faith can we have in these analytics? Wouldn't you suspect that there's some question marks that could be placed on some of these cases? I mean, it seems like for the most part, law enforcement in Alabama is very negligent about being proactive when it comes to people's houses burning down. Many times people believe that law enforcement themselves, when they have a family or a household that they don't want in their community, are the first ones to make sure the house burns down so they don't have to deal with those people in hopes that they leave the community. And this is just what we can gather by looking at some recent arson arrests in the state of Alabama. Imagine all the things we don't know. Imagine all the covert stories we've never heard. All the people whose houses burnt down and they thought it was accidental or they couldn't prove it, or they just had an enemy that maybe they didn't even know about. This is just what's on the surface. Imagine deep down how bad things really are in Alabama, a state where many businesses and homes today are boarded up and burnt up. And you drive by a town and you see businesses that are closed and houses that are burnt, and you think, well, the industry's left and things got bad and people had to leave. But in reality, that's not the truth about why many of these houses and even entire towns in Alabama are abandoned. The reality is that a lot of people do get ran out of Alabama, and today's story should just be an eye-opening situation into realizing that perhaps the reason things are dirt cheap in Alabama is because people there can make everything you have disappear. So next time you're driving through Alabama on your way to somewhere better and see a burnt down house on the side of the road, just remember that there could be a very interesting story behind how that building burnt down. Intentions, motives, family feuds, hate, and of course good old racism all contribute to this situation. And for the people who don't believe me, not recent, back in 2002, 400 people lost their lives in a 5-year period, with African Americans being 4 times more propense to being the victim of one of these fire death events. So in the state of Alabama, as always, the African American community is always disproportionately more likely to be the victim of whatever horrendous thing the state can throw at you. Now, I wasn't able to get newer analytics on what's going on in Alabama right now for fires, but based on this old information, in 5 years in Alabama, you have roughly as many people dying in house fires as you do in 1 year in Chicago from shootings. So this should just give you an idea that this isn't, it can't be accidental. It's too much. Okay, think about that. In 5 or 6 years in Alabama, you have the equivalent number of people dying in house fires as you do in 1 year in Chicago with 3 million people. So Chicago and Alabama both have about roughly the same population, just to give you an idea, right? So think about that. As many people died in 5 years in Alabama house fires, it's the same number as people that are killed in 1 year in Chicago from gun violence or homicides in general, right? You think that can be accidental? It doesn't analytically make sense. Then you look at the overdose death rates in Alabama. If these were all meth labs, then you would have other analytics to go along with it that you don't. None of it makes sense. The reality is these are not accidental fires. Overwhelmingly, too many of these fires are purposeful. Arson in Alabama, a serious crime under the state laws, but many times it's the law itself who's making these things happen, leading to people having to leave their homes and entire towns being abandoned. The propensity of fire in Alabama is not a light one. Of course, like always, many people are going to say that my video was opinion-based. So on this video today, we brought some analytics, some numbers, and some stories. Perhaps there's more credibility in that than there is in my opinion, victim blamers.